Boom and Bodo. We are live on Kingdom Purpose Radio and live on social media. That's Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. This is Kingdom. This is Reboot Your Biblical Perspective live talk show coming to you live from the Trinidad Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, West Indies. The one and only talk show where we actually approach biblical literature as well as present modern day challenges via the lens of the ancient Hebrew principle of the scriptures. And we do so step by step, verified by our pragmatic research at the International Institute of Pneumatology. We would like to give a huge shout out to everyone joining us on Kingdom Purpose Radio, YouTube, and Facebook. We have not been on for some time, and so this is our debut back on the scene. So huge shout out to everybody at Kingdom Purpose Radio. Huge shout out to everybody joining us on YouTube, as well as on Facebook. All right, we are actually running a silent session today, a nice quiet session today, where we are going to be speaking about something in particular that seems to be a very, very common and trending topic today. Very common, very trending topic in our world today. Right? We have been so for those of you who are actually joining us, the topic that we're going to be talking about here today is, believe it or not, vaccination. Right now, there's a common perspective. There's a common perspective that the vaccination that we are hearing about in the world today, there seems to be a perspective out there that the vaccination is a mark of the beast. Right? Ketura, give them a shout out.
I was not about to say shout out to everyone joining us on Kingdom Purpose TV and Radio as well as on Facebook, YouTube Live. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a nice rainy afternoon here in Trinidad and Tobago. So this kind of goes with the mood, nice mellow and um, somewhat of a slow drive this evening. So I look forward to this topic because this has been one that has been plaguing the internet, especially within Christianity. A lot of people are in fear. A lot of people I personally know are in somewhat of a worry, a bit concerned about how to approach this because there are lots of talk. I mean, when you turn on every corner right now, there's chatter on this topic. This whole vaccine thing, is it the mark of the beast? Is it something that we should be concerned about? Is it God's will? Is it, Satan? Is it of Satan? So there's a lot of talk on it. I'm really excited, Zane. This is a really good topic. So let's jump right into it.
Yeah, so there is a very strong presence, and for some time I've actually been blessings and much love to Marianne joining us on Facebook. She says she's driving, so she won't be interacting. Right now, there has been for some time this presence of this theme um, that the vaccination, no vaccination, and this entire perspective that the vaccination is a mark of the beast, right? The thing that is that everybody is using to refer to say, well, this is what the Bible was talking about. They're going to inject you with a chip. I've heard a lot of versions of this mark of the beast, the mark of the beast perspective, and today I think that we haven't been on for some time, and for everybody joining us on Kingdom Purpose Radio, joining us on Kingdom Purpose Radio, it is actually necessary that we let everybody know that, hey, we have been off for some time, but we are here, because and we are here for how long? Well, about 2 to 3 weeks that we have not been on. Right? We've had some challenges on our side, but we are back online and back live. Right. So is this vaccination drive the mark of the beast? Okay, what do you think about that? What do you think about, is this the mark of the beast?
Well, I know the answer, right? So I don't want to give it away. But I'd share that I, growing up as a child, would have heard because I was raised in a denomination known as Seventh Day Adventism. And there was a lot of talk within the organization, something that we were pretty much schooled in from pretty young about um, the events that are written in Matthew as well as in Revelation. And the doctrine suggests that the movements that are taking place in the world has a lot to do with the mark of the beast. The number of the beast is 666, and the beast being the Antichrist. And as a result, a lot of Christians that I know have been looking to different governments, different regions of the world, to see who is the Antichrist and who is going to take on this prophecy, so to speak, and
Right.
fulfill it. And so there has been a lot of tension and apprehension to an extent when so I have abandoned that faith for those of you who are listening and don't know me. And what I'm seeing when I stand back and look on the outside, that there are a lot of people, genuine souls, that are really concerned that what is taking place here is their participation with the Antichrist, and it's going to interfere with their salvation, which is something that people hold very dear to their heart because nobody wants to be, as the doctrines would teach,
Mm.
tossed into hell and all of these different things that goes around. So as it relates to the topic, I think that by the end of this episode, this segment, when we clear this up, for those of you who are listening, if you have had any uncertainty, you should be at peace to know what is the scriptural perspective of this and how to engage it or not engage it, as however you may choose. So I won't give
Yeah.
away the answer. I'll leave that for us to unravel bit by bit.
Yeah, I myself I had been schooled for many years. I think from some total of the 32 years of my life that I had been involved in the Pentecostal persuasion of this of the Bible. And notice I'm saying the
Mm,
Pentecostal persuasion because every denomination is a persuasion.
right.
And I had been, trained to look out for what we now refer to as the futurist eschatology from a theological standpoint, which is where you're looking for the book of Revelation to be fulfilled in our lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the book of Revelation to be fulfilled where we have, the presence of the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, a rapture coming, or some person don't believe in the rapture, and then the tribulation period that we talk about, and then from the tribulation we go into the 1,000 year reign and the second coming of Jesus. All of these things I had been very familiar with within the Pentecostal arena, right? And for those who actually follow me on Facebook, they know that in 2015 I walked away from the Pentecostal denominational perspective, but even more than that, I was about to walk away from Christianity as a whole. And I was actually my I faced some circumstances, and I had certain experience that challenged my the logic of the denominational perspective. It challenged the logic of the denominational perspective, and therefore it challenged my identity because whatever you use as your priority in life, you are using as your point of comparison, and therefore you're using to define who you are, your potential, your limitation, and how to make decisions. Yeah, and so over this period of time, I what we did in particular was we took the denominational perspectives of the Bible and we took them to task, meaning via an experimental process, took the denominational perspectives and we formulated experiments to see if the denominational perspectives yielded any power, as everybody preach. Everybody preach God is love and God is good and God is powerful and God is sovereign and God can do anything. And so we took not only the Pentecostal but the other, the general themes of the westernized or modern day Christian culture, and we put it to an experimental process, and were disappointed thoroughly to see that what we had been fed was not actually yielding fruit. And we spent 2 years doing that, as well over 400 experiments, where we where we actually took that perspective and we created a lot of methods to actually put it to task, and we saw nothing. Now, naturally, when we put this to task with well over 400 experiments and we saw nothing, and all of these experiments were from the perspective of our modern Christian culture, naturally that caused the book of Revelation to come into question. Because everything that we know here right now with regards to the modern day Christian culture, everything that we know or think that we know is actually surrounding this book of Revelation. The preaching of the gospel.
Right.
You need to get people saved before Jesus come back. All of these things are actually taught, and from the perspective that ties the book of Revelation into it. And if every experiment that we ran, the results were futile, were almost nothing, then naturally the book of Revelation came into question. Now everybody who actually follows us know that the first time I saw results was actually through Curry Blake's DHT, right? And I saw results, but in some areas I didn't see results, and so the research was investigation into that was actually launched whilst we tested the common westernized perspective. And then it took us for 2 years, in 2015 and 2016. And 2016 is where we actually proved and concluded that the westernized perspectives were fruitless, they were not bearing fruit in any form or fashion, as well as the fact that we were able to challenge our understanding of the book of Revelation, and realize that we had been so off. Our perspective of the book of Revelation was massively misguided. Right? Now that caused us to turn to the Jews in particular to find what their understanding of the Bible is, and then we realized that a lot of the modern Jewish perspectives have some westernized church culture in it, their church perspectives, and that caused us to go back to the ancient Hebrews. Now in 2016, and that is actually where we are right now with regards to the International Institute of Pneumatology, where we went back to the ancient Hebrews and we began to see results with their perspective of the Bible. With the author's perspective. When we say their perspective, we're talking about the author's perspective of the Bible.
Yeah, a lot of people are probably wondering, why go back to the ancient Hebrew? Like, what's the significance? But it's only logical, right? You go back to the mindsets of the ones who wrote the books,
right,
to understand what they meant by what they were stating.
So we needed to find out what was their thought process, what is the foundation from what they're speaking about. We were able to identify that, and we saw results. Now, on the topic of the book of Revelation, what we came to realize is that, number one, the book of Revelation, and for those of you who may not be very familiar with the book of Revelation, and for those of you who have studied the book of Revelation, I know that what I'm about to say here would be very controversial, but the International Institute of Hematology has actually very, very comfortably been able to identify the context of the book of Revelation. And the first thing that we can assert is that the book of Revelation has nothing to do with the westernized Christian community. Yes, unfortunately, the hype, we just took down that kite.
Just like that.
Just like that. You just take the kite out of the sky. Boom! And that has fallen.
So, for those who are hearing this for the first time, Zane, when you say it has nothing to do with westernized Christianity, what exactly do you mean by that? When you say nothing to do, 'cause a lot of people take, I mean, the whole, all the doctrines that we know are founded through whether it's Protestant, non-Protestant, somewhat comes from this Revelation, books of Revelation. So, what are you saying by that?
So what I mean by that is that we have been able to identify that predominantly the Old Testament, even though we can read in Old Testament now and gain information from it. In the time that these books were written, if you and I right now, being a non-circumcised Israelite, was among any one of the Old Testament characters. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Let me reframe that. If you and I and anybody listening to this were not circumcised Israelites, if we lived amongst in the same time frame, so any one of the time frames of the biblical characters, because these characters lived in different time frames, right? Different eras on the timeline of in the timeline of world history. And if any one of us existed around that time, it may be news to you to say that you and I, if we existed around that time frame, whilst these men were alive, we would have never, ever, ever, ever seen the scriptures. We would not have ever been able to talk to them either, or to be taught by them, unless we left our nation, left where we were living, came to the nation of Israel, and decided that we were going through their initiation rites to be considered a circumcised person, right? And we would have had to be, if you were a male, we would have had to be circumcised, physically circumcised, to come into the covenant, to be included in the nation, and you needed to be baptized or ceremonially washed, and your baptism was unto Moses. Which means that the whole Old Testament, when we really look at it, we can read it. We can read it now, because now we are post-cross, after Paul's teaching of the gospel, after Paul taking the things and the promises and the prophecies of the Old Testament and showing how it is being fulfilled through Jesus, who reconciled the division that existed in the world. Now, in the biblical world, the division that existed was that there were circumcised people and uncircumcised people. The circumcised people were in covenant with God, and the uncircumcised people had no covenant with God, and therefore did not know God. Which is why Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 that the uncircumcised were outside the covenants of promise, without hope, and without hope in the world, and without God. They had no formal connection or formal relationship with God. And when we say relationship, most of us, when I say relationship, you hear relationship as in you spend time with God. No, the biblical context of relationship is that you did not have a contract with God. There was no contract, no relationship agreement, no covenant that you would have had with God. So to start with, that means that the scriptures in particular, as we are reading it, everything that is written in the scriptures had nothing to do with the uncircumcised world, or the world that was uncircumcised. And if we lived around their time, we would have been part of the outside of that community, which means we would have never known about those scriptures, because nobody prior to the cross really came into contact with scriptures unless you are a nation that came and took over Israel and for some reason found the Torah and started to read the Torah. But nobody from the outside world who was uncircumcised came into contact with the Torah. Everything that is mentioned in the Old Testament was written unto Jews. Sorry, not to Jews, unto circumcised Israelites. Right? I'm saying not Jews because the term Jews only came after Israel was divided as a nation after the reign of King Solomon. So you would not have come into contact with this. So that's my first point. Sorry, to continue my first point, when Jesus came, right? What Jesus did, the Apostle Paul came about not long after the crucifixion. And do you know that before the Apostle Paul came about, all of the disciples stayed within the circle of the circumcised, except for we know of Peter, who had certain visions, and when an uncircumcised Roman called upon him, God told him, don't deem unclean what is clean. But predominantly, these men stayed within the circle of their community. The Apostle Paul was the very first man to come along to take the knowledge of Jesus as a Messiah of humanity and educate the uncircumcised world, the non-circumcised world of the Messiah. Now, if you go back to Galatians chapter 1 and 2, you'll notice that when Paul made the decision that he wanted to go to the uncircumcised, he consulted Peter, James, and John, who were the disciples of Jesus. And they made an agreement that Peter, James, and John would stay within the circle of the circumcised community. And Paul and Barnabas will go to the uncircumcised community. And there's great reason for that, because they would have been accustomed to the world of the circumcised, and not to mention that all of the judgments that were spoken by Moses were not spoken to the entire planet. It was spoken to the community of the circumcised. So then when we look at the book of Revelation was given to the Apostle John. And the Apostle John was one of the men that decided to stay within the circle of the circumcised, which means the revelation given to the Apostle John was not for the uncircumcised community, which is the community that you and I belong to.
So what you're saying then, Zane, is that all these different theories are misrepresentations of Revelation, where people are scared, misrepresentations that are causing people to be, especially Christians, to be scared of taking things like the vaccine because they're thinking that that's them pledging their loyalty to the Antichrist. And there are a lot of people taking it unknowingly, and those who take it will be doomed. And so all of these theories that came about because of a lack of understanding that the book that people take this information from was not written to address those who are of the uncircumcised Jews.
Particularly the book of Revelation.
Right.
Even some of the New Testament books that we are reading right now have been written by some of the disciples, and you realize that it is written in a manner and in a style that is very different from the Apostle Paul's letters.
Mm-hmm.
And that's simply because those who were Jesus' disciples, they decided to stay with the circle of the circumcised. And so when they write their letters, like Peter, James, John, it sounds very law orientated, because they are speaking to that community in their language. Whilst Paul in particular, he wrote his letters, and you don't see anything about the law in his letters. He just says old man, new man.
Mm-hmm.
Because Paul speaks to the uncircumcised through the lens of the Garden of Eden. Old man, new man. Whilst Peter, James, and John and the other disciples, they stayed within the community of the circumcised, and so they use the jargon of the law. That is what they know.
So that's why it may seem like a mystery. And a lot of people are there trying to figure out what is the beasts coming out of the ocean and all these different things.
Right.
It's mysterious because it's not written in a language or in a style that has to do with our modern times.
Our modern perspective, our modern way of thinking will not be able to interpret those things, because that is written to a people, a nation,
Mm-hmm.
whose norm, was to memorize the Torah, memorize Genesis to Deuteronomy in Hebrew, word for word, verbatim, memorize it. Whilst we go to school in our modern day culture, and our common language, our common knowledge is our common academic schooling. We have
Right.
the same common mathematics system, common English, common social studies. All of these things are common to us so that we can speak to each other and we understand each other. In that community, the Torah was the common knowledge. So all of these things are written to people who study who learn the Torah, memorize Torah, and so when these things are spoken, they will understand it because everything that is being spoken, even in the book of Revelation, can be found. All of these things, including the mark of the beast, which is what we come into here today, including the mark of the beast, has been written has been written to a community that memorize Torah, and some of them even went as far in the advanced stage of learning where they memorize the prophets. And so everything that you see in the book of Revelation would be dialect that comes or imagery that comes from Torah as well as comes from prophets. And so to the Jew, they will read the book of Revelation and they understand it perfectly. If they come from the same if they come from the same lineage, of course, they read it and they understand it perfectly because it is referencing imagery, it is referencing perspectives, it is referencing themes that they went to school and learned and memorized. So in our culture, this seems so coded. It seems complicated because you didn't go to school to learn that. The second point that I have to make here with the book of Revelation is that the book of Revelation is really the continuation of the book of Daniel. Right? And if you go into the book of Daniel that we can read right now through what we know as the Bible, if you go into the book of Daniel, everything that Daniel saw in his visions, he was told to seal it up. Right? He was told to seal up the book. And the book of Revelation is where you see Jesus tells John to not seal it up, but to reveal it, which is why it is called the revelation of Jesus. It is the revealing of Jesus Christ. And if you go back to Daniel, you'll notice that every vision that Daniel had, it was spoken to Daniel by the angel Gabriel, and the angel Gabriel told him that this is to your people. Your people meaning the nation of Israel, the circumcised people, the people who are in covenant with God. And so the book of Revelation is really an elaboration of these prophecies. If you compare it, you realize that there was no alteration or no deviation. It was just a continuation of the book of Daniel, which means that the book of Revelation particularly is a continuation that is actually written to the circle of the circumcised. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. So I just want to take a moment to pause in and shout out some of our listeners. We have Mary and Jenky joining us and commenting in the comment section,
Blessings and much love.
as well as Karen Burke.
Karen Burke. We haven't seen Karen in a while. Karen, we hope that all is well. Marianne said that she was actually driving and so on, but I've seen she has some comments here. Blessings and much love to you, Marianne.
Yeah, I can't see the others on, but just shout out to everyone who's joining us. So we are here in the middle of a discussion about the mark of the beast and the different doctrines that arise out of this whole vaccination drive, whether it is something that you need to be concerned about as it relates to Revelation or not. And so far, we have identified that the book of Revelation has been misconstrued as it relates to us in westernized world, and many of the doctrines so far have been applied out of a misunderstanding that the book has nothing to do with the uncircumcised world.
Right.
And as a result, these doctrines come about that, this is the Antichrist, the chip is going to be in your hand, the plagues, the bounding of Satan, and all of these different things have come about. And so far we identify that it has been written in a particular style that is specific to those who were under, would you say, contract or covenant with God,
So yes, those who are of the Mosaic covenant,
the Mosaic
specifically
covenant.
the Mosaic covenant, right? Which means that you had to be circumcised. If if you were not circumcised, you were not considered part of that community. If you were not baptized unto Moses, you were not part of that community. To be part of that community really necessitated that you had to actually go through the initiation rites and go through what was normal for all Jews or all Israelites. You memorize Torah, word for word. Now, here's some things that you can look for in the New Testament where you have confirmation that this is not written to you. For example, number one, if you go to the first 5 chapters of the book of Revelation, it actually says that the book of Revelation is written to the 7 churches, quote unquote 7 churches, right? But if you read the text, you realize that Yeshua, in speaking to John, does not identify any one of those things through what Paul identified as church, because the context of church came from the Apostle Paul. If you read those five chapters, you actually realize that it's actually directed to synagogues, right? And if it is actually connected and directed to that community, then you know that has nothing at all to do with us, because none of us here in any form or fashion have have actually gone through the initiation rites for that, and none of us gathered, and none of the people that John was John in John's day who were not Jews would have gathered in a synagogue. Go check the first 5 chapters, and you notice that it's written to those believers who were in synagogues,
Mm-hmm.
right? Another thing you can look for, Matthew chapter 24, which is interconnected with the book of Revelation and the unfolding of the book of Revelation. And you realize that Matthew 24 actually starts off with Jesus saying, not one of these stones, he was standing right next to the temple in Jerusalem, right next to the beautiful temple in Jerusalem. And he said, not one of these stones shall be left upon another. In 70 AD, that temple was destroyed, and not one stone was left upon another. Keturah, if you Google Jerusalem right now, do you see a temple on the mount, or do you see a mosque?
As far as I see, you see a mosque.
You see a mosque. Because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD when Rome besieged Jerusalem, and destroyed it. Which means if the temple is not present, as Jesus related the destruction that was coming, unfolded in Revelation, is no longer present, then what are we looking for? What are we looking for? There is no temple to throw down again, which means just by that reference there, just that one simple fact, you have just come and brought into context that the entire book of Revelation is now outside of its space, meaning it is outside of its time frame,
Mm-hmm.
because there is no more temple. The second thing that you can say with regards to Jesus is that Jesus said, he says, this generation shall not pass away until such and such and such, which means he said this generation. How much is that generation in the Bible?
40 years.
40 years is a generation in the Bible. Count from the time Jesus left, which is understood to be AD 33. Count 40 years, and that takes you to AD 73. 40 years, yeah? Right. It's 87, 73 said this generation will not pass. When did the temple fall and was burned to the ground? AD 70,
Mm-hmm.
which means, just as he said, it happened within the generation. So now this brings me to the mark of the beast. Because if this is outside of its time frame, then what we assume the mark of the beast is just a figment of the church's imagination. They are heavily misguided. And it seems like nobody's actually stopping and taking the time to pay attention to what they're reading, and everybody is actually driven through the mainstream perspectives that this vaccination is the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
And if you bring in the without having to touch anything else, if we just narrow in on the mark of the beast, then you will come to realize that the mark of the beast is said to be something that would be on the forehead and the hand, right? Of it's something that we place on the forehead and on the hand, which everybody is familiar with. You know what they're not familiar with? And for those of you listening in, it's very important that we understand that everything in the scriptures references something in the scriptures. There's nothing that is mentioned in scriptures that doesn't come from the foundation of the memorization of Torah and prophets. And so if you want to understand the scriptures, you need to find where is this first mention in the Hebrew. Where is the first mention of this in scriptures? And its first mention is usually the the area in the Bible where the context of that principle or that theme, as well as not only context but the precedent for its use, is established. And if you go back to the Old Testament, go back and you'd realize that what is being referred to as the mark of the beast. Firstly, let's deal with the beast and then we'll understand the mark of the beast. Now we know that the mark has something to do with something in the Old Testament, and the beast also has something to do with that of the Old Testament. Right? And the beast in particular is actually something that goes way back to the Garden of Eden, where after man makes his decision and finds himself outside of the garden, God clothes him with skin. It is understood to be animal skin. Indicative of the fact that man was no longer functioning as Yahweh Elohim anymore. He was just functioning like an animal, being a receiver of thoughts and not a generator. And since after that, you notice that all of the sacrificial system of the Old Testament use animals as sacrifices. And then when Daniel had his visions, Daniel actually saw the leaders of the nations, of these Gentile nations. They weren't leaders of the Gentile nations. Each and every one of those leaders were beasts, they were animals. Which means beast here is in reference to an uncircumcised individual who would have been king of a nation. That's the only people, the only people that exist right here in this world. We live in around here. We live in an uncircumcised community. This circumcised and uncircumcised community pretty much officially ended when this temple was destroyed. We have Jews that still believe that Jesus is not the Messiah and they're still waiting for him. But just by this identification here, notice this has nothing to do with this world. So the beast is an uncircumcised individual, an uncircumcised king. What is the mark? The mark was on the forehead and on the hand. If you go back to the Old Testament, anybody who actually is a serious student of the Bible will know that in the Old Testament, the Jews, when God told them to put the word all over the place so they don't forget it, and so it keeps their mind centered in it, because the Mosaic covenant was also a contract of the mind. And in keeping it ever present all around them, what they did is that they actually used what you call phylacteries. And phylacteries were tiny boxes that they would tie on their forehead and on their hand. And in the phylactery, they would take parchment and write Deuteronomy chapter 6. They will write the Shema on the parchment, which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. You shall love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And they'll write Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 on the parchment, fold it, and put it in the phylacteries. So they keep it on their head and on their hand. This is how they actually, let's say, mark themselves according to what the name of Yahweh was, so that they do not forget that Yahweh is God and He is one God, and they love Him, and they are loving Him with all of their heart, soul, mind, and strength. In the book of Revelation, this references the mark of the beast, which means the person was actually going to do something that was going to imitate the hand and the wrist. And instead of the parchments, instead of it being unto God, it will be unto the beast. And the beast, whoever this king is, he would try to take the place of Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
which means he was going to exalt himself as God, and you would have to worship him, just like they
Right.
worship Yahweh. Who was the Roman emperor that did something like that? That's Nero Caesar.
Nero Caesar, yeah.
Nero Caesar made a decree that everybody was supposed to address him as Lord and God. The Apostle John found himself on the island of Patmos because he refused to address the man as Lord and God. That happened in seven. That all of these things came into fruition around the time of 70 AD and coming into 70 AD before the destruction. And then they say that his number, if you had wisdom, his number is 666. Now, if you take Nero Caesar's name and write it in Hebrew, it comes up to 666. You know that?
Yeah.
Right. So again, around 70 AD. And then 666 has numerical value in scriptures. If you go back to the first mention of 666, it's actually used in reference to King Solomon and a certain amount of wealth that actually was given to King Solomon. Its indication was that the beast would be a wealthy beast, a beast with a lot of money. Nero Caesar was a wealthy emperor, a lot of money, corrupted badly, but rich because of the wealth of Rome. So, on all accounts, the mark of the beast was fulfilled in 70 AD, and this here is the context of this mark. So, with that identified, it is very clear that the vaccine and the mark of the beast are not synonyms. You know, it's a nice. It may come across like it's a nice. It may come across like it is a nice. How do we put that? A nice perspective to drive people in fear, but they are actually in a baseless fear, a fear that has nothing to do with the actual scripture. The mark of the beast has long gone. It has
So
nothing to do with vaccine here right now.
so when you remove the mark of the beast out of the picture and the book of Revelation as it relates to the Antichrist and all of these things that people are concerned about. So you have really debunked that this has nothing to do with the Christianity, not supposed to, as a matter of fact. Then that leaves decisions for decisions concerning the vaccine in the hands of making decisions driven by logical interpretation.
Well, if I am to approach the mark of the vaccine, removing the mark of the beast,
Mm-hmm.
then automatically there is no there is no there is no, let's say, divine or scriptural reason that tells you that you should or should not take the vaccine. And if
Yeah.
it is there is no divine or scriptural reason that indicates that you should or should not take the vaccine, then the taking of the vaccine is now in your hands. That's according to your decision. You want to take the vaccine, you take the vaccine. If you don't want to take the vaccine, then don't take the vaccine.
Right, right.
But there is no
Simple.
scriptural reason that you can use if you remove the mark of the beast thoroughly. there is no scriptural reason that exists that you can tie to a vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Vaccines are not even mentioned in the scriptures. The
No.
only thing that they used to actually interlink vaccine with scripture was the mark of the beast, was the end time theory.
Yeah.
And if we understand that this thing has been fulfilled already, and therefore you are reading something that has already happened, then the only thing that I did a video recently on my Facebook wall called End Times or No End Times. I would encourage you to look at that video so that you can understand where you are, end times or no end times. And if when you come to the realization that there's nothing that is actually tying you to the mark of the beast or the book of Revelation, that video, End Times or No End Times, you can actually access it on my Facebook wall. Or for those of you joining us on Kingdom Purpose Radio, you can find it on our YouTube channel. That is ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology. Just type in End Times or No End Times, International Institute of Pneumatology, and you will find it. Right? And in that video, I actually gave how Jesus and the apostles would have no, or what is the culture of the scriptures, even towards the book of Revelation now. So I'm not going to get into that here. When it comes to vaccine, there is nothing that is tying that. And so the Christian community that is trying to make this a biblical thing, a scriptural, um, let's say, use scripture as strength to fortify or to support their bias concerning vaccine or their bias concerning no vaccine. I would like to clearly assert that it is unfounded. It has nothing to do with the mark of the beast. And therefore, it is manipulative to use
Mm-hmm.
scripture to confirm your bias, whether it's pro vaccine or anti vaccine.
So it's pretty much spreading false information.
It's spreading false rumors. A rumor is usually false. It's spreading false information. And you're actually instilling fear into persons who may not know better and trying to save themselves according to what they may understand salvation to be by not taking the vaccine. This has nothing to do with the scriptures anymore. I believe that everybody here has found themselves in a position where they have to walk according to their heart.
Mm-hmm.
But what you cannot do is use the scriptures to justify a bias outside of its context. That is actually flagrantly lying.
Mm-hmm.
That's fabrication of the truth or fabrication of information, because you can't fabricate truth. Truth is truth. It's a fabrication of information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So at this point, I think all of those who are listening would have a clearer understanding now, based on the ancient Hebrew interpretation of the Bible, as we mentioned in the beginning of this episode. The scriptures cannot, and the Bible cannot be read and interpreted through a westernized lens. It's just like taking a book. I'd use another culture to give us a better understanding because maybe we are so familiar with it and doing it. It's like if I was not born and raised in let's say a Latin American country or Brazil, or I'm just gonna randomly name another country. Then I cannot take the liberty to take a book that one of the authors or the authors would have compiled in that region in that time and take my Caribbean interpretation of it and apply it and say that this is what the book and the authors were trying to say. Because there's so much to what the authors may be expressing that I may take it according to my culture and my understanding and corrupt it, corrupt the authenticity of the book and the material. And
right.
that's what we have actually done with the Bible. Us in the westernized world, we have taken the liberty to take a book that was written with through a particular mindset and authors using their own language and expressions and corrupted it by saying this is what we take words like God is love, and we say this is what it means to love, and we apply our westernized understanding of love. Same time with judgment and salvation, we see these words and then we take liberties of applying our understanding of it. Whereas the authors are the ones, although they are not alive in person with us now, they're through the research at the International Institute of Pneumatology, we have gone back into the ancient Hebrew thought. And it's only through that thought perspective can you really understand what they were saying. There's so much of gold in that book. But it's so unfortunate and so sad that here we have taken these things, and it really gets to my heart to see with topics where like vaccines and mark of the beast and so on is concerned, that there are a lot of people struggling, really struggling with themselves, with their faith, because they are scared. They are really scared. And, a lot of this false information has caused Christianity to appear as one of the most misinformed religions on the face of the earth right now. And
Yeah,
so
boy.
people, it's like making a show out of it simply because people take their own understandings, what they think it is, and apply it to the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think everyone who has joined us and those who are joining us and who will listen to this in the future, by now, by the end of as we draw to the end of this episode, we'll have a clearer understanding that the mark of the beast is not the vaccine. It has nothing to do with our our era and our time. I mean, there's a lot of information to recap, but I would strongly recommend if you came in late to listen to the beginning of from this segment, the beginning of this segment, to get some context where we explain that who the book was written for, to the circumcised world. And it's a lot of information, so I won't go back into all of it. But if you have any questions, we encourage you all to put your questions in the comment section. We definitely will get back to you as best as we can.
Definitely.
And if you are feeling a little bit more comfortable now that this information is out there, also feel free to share with us as well, because I know this is something that has been affecting a lot of people and their hearts, and there's information all left, right, and center, but a lot of it is misinformation that is inciting fear and
Yep.
condemnation.
Right? And for those of you who would like to know, okay, so we just nullified the mark of the beast and the use of the book of Revelation for our present age and our present era. How is the book of Revelation to be used, or how should the book of Revelation be approached? I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. That's ZKI. Just type in ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology, and you'll actually see one of our most recent videos there. It's called End Times or No End Time. In that video, I explain the context of the book of Revelation, which is what I lightly covered there today. But I also explained in part number two. Well, there's 2 points that I presented in that video, and in the second half of that video, I explained how the book of Revelation was meant to be approached in the spirit and the culture of the scriptures. Right. So if you're looking for that information, you can find it on our YouTube channel at ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology. For everyone joining us on Kingdom Purpose Radio, we are now wrapping up, and we thank each and every one of you for tuning in. And for tuning in for this, because this is a very relevant topic. Right? We would also like to shout out all those who are actually joining us on social media, especially on Facebook. I don't see anybody commenting on YouTube here today, but we have our Holy Sister Marianne Jenke, as well as Holy Sister Karen Burke, and huge shout out to Zina Poltorak. Zina, I have not heard that name in a long time. Like Zina. Right? So Zina Poltorak, blessings and much love. Thank you for actually taking the time to join us. And for anyone who you know, in particularly that desires context with regards to whether this vaccine is something sent by the devil himself, it's of the devil. If it's something that you have felt that people are convinced that it is something of the devil and they're damaging their salvation and all of these things, Please feel free to share this broadcast to them. You can share it from our Facebook, from my Facebook wall, Zane Peer on Facebook, or you can share it from our YouTube channel at ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology. Right, that is actually written on the screen on Facebook as well as YouTube, ZKI International Institute of Pneumatology. And huge shout out to Kingdom Purpose Radio, right, to actually access more programs, more enlightening programs, entertaining programs on Kingdom Purpose TV and radio. Specifically, radio, you can go to kingdompurposeradio.com. Kingdompurposeradio.com. And lastly, if you'd like to connect with us interactively, you would like to actually ask questions and get answers immediately, you can find us on Facebook at Life Mindset Mentors. Life Mindset Mentors. Right, so this is Rebooted Lyrical Perspective live talk show on Kingdom Purpose Radio. I am your host, Daniel Fuego, the Christ pneumatologist, and
Lady Katura, spiritual identity consultant.
we encourage you to push the power button on the hard drive of your scriptural understanding and your understanding of the mark of the beast and reboot your biblical perspective. Boom.